I lie there on my bed, letting my mind fall victim to a plague of sickening thoughts. Why did this have to happen to me? No, why did it have to happen to Jordan? He never did anything to deserve being pulled into such a mess. I've got nothing going for me, so why not me? Why Jordan? My mom would have probably been gone for the rest of the day, so I had the house to myself as I let these thoughts occupy my mind. I never really been the kind of person to hang out with a lot of people, but then again, I haven't really had much friends to begin with. Out of the small list of the friends I did have, Jordan was the only one I trusted and was the closest to. We didn't have much in common. I came from a dysfunctional family, whereas he came from a well-going and caring family. My parents were divorced and rather neglectful towards me. My dad hated me despite hardly being around to see me. My parents were always fighting with each other, while Jordan's parents were loving and a most polar opposite of mine. Jordan even had better luck in his social life than I did. He was well known at school and always showed kindness towards each other. He was a 4.0 student at the top of our class. I was the kid who got left at the back of the crowd, remaining unnoticed by the others. As different as we were, Jordan and I were always there for each other. We practically are closest brothers. My story starts on a regular afternoon, hanging out in Jordan's town, walking to the park. We liked to talk about girls, video games, sports, and often threw out a joke or two. Time flew by pretty fast, and Jordan realized it was getting late. I checked my watch to see that it nearly 9 in the evening. Jordan was worried that his parents would be concerned about the time. My mom wouldn't even notice I was gone, that is, if she was even home. We started back to Jordan's house, and he told me I could spend the night since I was pretty late already. He said his parents probably wouldn't mind. We could feel the cold wind hitting us in the face, so we zipped our jackets and jammed our hands into our pockets as we walked on. Jordan Street was nearly a block or two away by now. He suddenly stopped walking and turned to face the dark alleyway to our left. He stood there, frozen, staring blankly into the darkness in front of him. I glanced down the alley but saw nothing. He had once tried to scare me by doing something similar earlier, but this time there was something strange about him. Yeah, nice try, Jordan. It's not gonna work this time. He didn't budge. I started to feel worried, and looked around to see if anything was following us. Jordan, you alright? I asked. Still no response. He stood there in a paralyzed position. His view was fixed on something, as if some entity in the darkness was staring back at him. I took another look down the alley. I could see the road on the other side, lit by the moonlight, but the center was filled by an eerie darkness. I thought there might have been a wild animal of some sort, and Jordan caught a glance of its glow in its eyes. I still saw nothing, and I didn't want to get any closer. Jordan, stop! Man, this isn't even funny anymore, I said. No reply. I gave him a solid smack to the face, and he came around, which gave me the biggest sigh of relief. I thought there was something wrong. Don't scare me like that again, I said. He looked at me with confusion. Scare you like what? He questioned. You stood there staring blankly into space like you have gone mental, I said. I must have zoned out, but whatever. Let's get moving, or we'll be even later. He replied, then remaining silent for the rest of the walk. I couldn't help but look behind me every few minutes, seeing if they were watched by or followed by whatever he might have seen in the alley. We moved onwards until reaching his house. His mother and his dog, Exile, greeted us at the door. When we got inside, both of his parents questioned him on his lateness. We lost track of time, but we're all right, Jordan explained. I headed up to his bedroom while he asked his parents if I could stay the night. As I waited alone, my mind started to flood with questions about what happened earlier. Jordan came up the stairs a few moments later, carrying an inflatable mattress and some blankets for me to sleep on. It was about 10 p.m. if we got back into our beds and fell asleep. We woke up the next morning at 7:30, half an hour before school started. We rushed to get ready, sipping showers and breakfast, and ran out the door. On our way to school, I noticed something different about Jordan. Just by looking at him, he seemed quieter than usual and slightly bewildered. What's up, Jordan? You look like you were about to bust out crying like a little girl, I jokingly prodded. Normally he would have laughed at something like this, but there wasn't a slight chance of his expression. Him sullenly said, Nothing's the matter. I would just walk in a piece for once without having to listen to you. His gaze remained in front of him. He made no effort to make eye contact with me. He had never snapped at me like that before. Not to me. Not to anyone. I tried not to dwell on it too much, but I knew something had changed him and something definitely was wrong. Once we had gotten to school, it was 9:12 a.m., and so we went to the reception area to get a late pass. We would usually make something up if we were even late. Alarm clock broke, or maybe we whisked a cop or the wrong bus. But this time we just took our late slips without giving an excuse. We got to class, turned our late slips over to the teacher, and took our seats. Everything was going fine so far. I turned and noticed Jordan was staring blankly into space again, just like last night. He turned towards me with that damned blank expression on his face. I tried to break his stare by waving my hand in front of him, but he didn't even move an inch. I moved back and forth. He moved with me, not letting his eyes break contact with me. Then it happened. His cold, indifferent expression turned into a menacing, sick grin. He was staring directly into my mind, filling me with extreme feeling and fear of panic. The room faded away. The students, teachers, desks, windows, that goddamn flickering fluorescent light at the front of the class. They faded into darkness, and all what was left was Jordan, his eyes boring straight into my very being. I felt numb all over, and began to sweat. It was cold, nervous sweat, and I began to shake as adrenaline rushed through my body. Then I realized what was wrong. This wasn't Jordan I was looking at. This thing, whatever it was wearing Jordan as clothing. I was waiting for the flesh of his face to tear open along the seams, for his body to burst out under the sheer pressure of what was living inside. A dull, numb hum began to drove in my ear, becoming louder and sharper until it became well-defined, repetitive ring. Something moved in the darkness, and walls began to emerge from a dense fog and close in on us. The movement in the distance became our classmates, rustling through their backpacks and beginning to stand up. I recognized the ringing as the sound of the school bell. Jordan, or whatever this thing was, snapped back into the center of his seat and faced the front of the class, wearing a calm expression on his face. I tried to look around, but my body was still tense and paralyzed by fear. Didn't anyone else notice what just happened? Jordan stood up and walked out of my vision, leaving me staring at the window behind where he was sitting. "Hey man, what's the matter? Class is over and let's go to eat lunch," he said from behind. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the window, watching blurred objects move from outside. The stock slowly disappeared as I looked down my hands. They were shaking and my palms were cold and sweaty. I stood up slowly, and feeling lightheaded, I took a moment to look around the classroom. It was empty. The teacher had already wiped the board and left. I walked out of the room and looked both ways down the hallway. Jordan was nowhere in sight. I began to grow anxious, and as I walked down to the corridor, who or what was this being that possessed my best friend? I refused to accept that Jordan was consciously choosing to act like this. One moment he's the person I've been knowing for years, and the next I find myself fixed on the cold, uncaring eyes of another being. It made me sick just thinking about it. I walked out of the main building and felt the warm sun on my face. A cool, refreshing breeze passed by, and I took a moment before continuing to the lunch area. I sat down at a bench, trying to forget about earlier, and wondered where Jordan was. He came out of the office building carrying a lunchbox. He sat down opposite of me. "My mom came by to drop off my lunchbox. Let's see what we got here," he said. As he opened his lunchbox, he pulled out 2 Subway sandwiches and 2 cans of Sprite. "Here's yours, man." He handed me the sandwich and the soda. "Everything all right? You looked a bit pale." I opened the pop and took a long drink, which the uneasiness in my stomach. I opened the paper wrapping around the sandwich and took a bite. A mass of lettuce, grated carrots, and a meatball held together by a blob of melted Swiss cheese fell out on the side of the sandwich. It landed on my paper wrapping on the table, and thankfully not my lap. Jordan burst into laughter, pointing at my face. I had smeared a good amount of mayonnaise across my upper lip and chin. Tempting to save my contents of the sandwich, I took a napkin from in the lunchbox and wiped my face. Seeing him laugh made me feel that the worst had passed and things were taking a turn for the better. We finished our lunch and tossed the paper wrappers into the tin cans in the rubbish bin. As we turned to walk out of the lunching areas, Christian, one of our classmates, stood up from a bench near us and lost his balance. One foot remained in contact with the ground as he spun around, arms outstretched, attempting to grab whatever he could to use to stabilize himself. He latched onto his sleeve of Jordan's jacket, pulling them both down onto the ground while Christian dug to gain his balance. I reached down to give Jordan a hand. He stood up on his own and brushed off his pants, leaving me with an empty, outstretched hand. He started walking away from where we stood, not saying a word. I felt unnerved by his silence. Oh God, it's happening again. I thought, it'll just be another moment, dude, he said as he turned around looking towards me before entering the restroom. I sat back down at the bench and waited for him. Looking over to my right, I saw that Christian had managed to make it back on his feet. He handed off to the seniors' common room. I snickered to myself at the thought of it getting in there. What a joke, me, the unpopular kid being led into the commons room. A few minutes passed by and Jordan still hadn't returned. I stood up and headed towards the restroom to check on him. I thought of calling out his name, but figured it would be awkward while others standing around. No one was at the urinals, so I checked the stalls. They were all empty. Jordan must have slipped out when I wasn't looking, but he had come to the tables. I walked back outside and looked around, finding only a group of preparatory students chatting with each other, but no Jordan. I felt nervous, and I wondered where he might have gone and what he could have been doing. I heard a scream from the hallway to the right, and Jordan's girlfriend came running out crying with two of her friends following her. I ran down the hallway and saw the doors of the two common rooms closing shut. This wasn't good. I opened the doors, and stunned by what I saw, Christian was lying on the floor, knocked unconscious, with a small pool of blood foaming under his head. Jordan knelt above him, wrestling, driving his fist into the side of his classmate's head. I looked up from the unconscious body of being senseless beaten, and every muscle in my body froze. Instead of seeing a furious look on his face, I instead witnessed a familiar malevolent grin accompanied by a griefful laugh. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. I turned around and reached for the door, wanting no more of this. My hand missed and I fell to the ground, my vision blurred around me. Why won't just all go away? That was my last conscious thought before I blanked out completely. I woke up on the bed in the infirmary. The nurse must have heard me moving and came over to check on me. After making sure that I was all right, she said I was all better than the other boy. The other boy? I thought, oh, that's right, it was Christian. What happened slowly came back to me. I asked what happened to him. The nurse said that the flight was broke up by a teacher and the ambulance called to take Christian to the hospital. After the nurse checked me out at the office, I looked at the clock on the wall and saw that it had been an hour since school was released. I walked home by this time by myself. It had been 3 weeks since that incident. Jordan returned from his suspension a week ago, and things seemed to have returned back to normal, apart from the occasional rumor about the fight. I went over to Jordan's house on Sunday. I mentioned that Christian was due back from the recuperation the next day, but we didn't talk about the fight between the two of them. When I arrived at school that Monday, I saw Christian getting dropped off by his dad. He still had a lot of bruising and was wearing a neck brace and a few small bandages. Jordan didn't show up though, most likely wanting to avoid Christian on his first day back. The bell rang and sounded to start off the first period. Students started to head towards their respective classrooms. I was on my way to English when I noticed a group of people forming around a section of lockers. There were a few faculty members trying to keep the students at a distance from what happened. Another fight? I thought. I hadn't heard anything going on before though. I got closer to the crowd, but couldn't make out what was going on. I turned around in the opposite direction and saw Christian sitting on a bench with a teacher kneeling in front of him, holding him reassuringly back by his shoulders. He had a chronic look on his face, and I heard the teacher speaking softly in a calm voice to him. I turned back and tried bending down to see if I could get a glimpse of what happened, but the area was still cluttered with too many people. I got to classmate attention from in the crowd and asked him what happened. Someone broke into Christian's locker and did some real, messed up shit. He responded. I pulled him out of the crowd and looked onto his face. Tell me exactly what happened. I don't know, man. I only saw it from a moment, alright? Someone shoved a bunch of bloody animal parts into his locker. Man, that's messed up, he said as he frantically stumbled out of the crowd and away into the classroom. Think of how all this sounds. Your best friend begins acting possessed, then he has a psychological breakdown and bulges a classmate into the face to a bloody mess. He ends up absent on the day I find a pile of bloody, distinct animal bits in a locker set of a classmate. I took off out of the school gates without hesitation, going straight to Jordan's house. I ignored the blurring in my legs and I ran, thinking of only what happened. I had no clear idea as why I was going to Jordan's, but something clicked in my mind and I immediately felt that he had something to do with this guy's mess in the locker. I was getting close. I ran up the dirt path from the rear towards the house. The front door was left wide open. Anxiety struck me like a brick wall as I walked closer, becoming increasingly distressed. I took a step through the doorway and heard a splash under my foot as I landed onto the wood floor. I looked down to see that I had plunged my foot into a puddle of blood. My tongue caught in the back of my throat and my heart pounded faster. The puddle led across the floor into the kitchen. Part of me wanted to run away that very instant, but I continued to walk slowly towards the kitchen, following the dark red path. The cartly drawer was pulled out, and the handle and knives were staked with blood. I grabbed a knife, fearing that the monster may be lurking in the house. The path of blood led out of the kitchen and another door in the hallway. As I followed into the base of the staircase, a nauseating stench in the house became more apparent. I held the knife out in front of me with both hands, turning around to see if anybody was there. The house was silent, and I stood there for about a minute. As I turned back to face the staircase, there was a loud thud at my feet, and something warm splattered against my face. There at my feet was a dissipated, skinny animal carcass, about half the size of a dog. It was still wet with blood. I heaved, but nothing came out. I saw a moment at the top of the stairs, and quickly looked up. A figure stood there, silhouetted by the glare of the window behind him. It was like nothing I've ever seen before. It had pointy ears sticking out of the top of its head, and its long arms extended down to his feet. I just stood there watching me. I couldn't manage to take my gaze off of it, nor could I move. I was paralyzed, and began to lose sense of time. I didn't know how long it stood there, staring at it. Eventually my eyes adjusted to the brightness from the window. I could start to make out the distinct features of this thing that stood before me. Its arms had moving joints that regular humans, and apparently to limp dangling there, and creature made no effort to use them. It had a muzzle of a dog, and its upper part was covered with animal fur. I was so clueless to what it was. My eyes soon became completely adjusted to the lighting, and I gradually became filled with horror. This wasn't some type of otherworldly beast. No, it was assembled in this world. I could see the seams of torn flesh where one of arms met with another. The clear difference in the skin tone. I had no interest in wondering where the addition limbs came from. The funny hide of the canine was draped over with the front of its thing's bare human chest. The blood dripped down from it until it reached a pair of dark red-stained jeans. I recognized the face of what it was, the dog, named Allergies, now positioned over the thing's face as some sort of a mask. I knew who it was, but then there was no way I could ever accept it. I couldn't. I began to panic. And this must have also been noticed by the beast. I started to make a growling sound at me, and arched its back, preparing to pounce on its prey. I was that prey. I broke my eye contact, and I realized I was still gripping the knife I had took from the kitchen. The beast leaped from the top of the stairs, and I raised my arms. There was gashing sound, and I was knocked back on the ground. The weight of this monster was bearing down on me. The mask made out of Exile's head came detached from the wearer's face, and I could clearly see that now it was Jordan. I felt the warm liquid run down over my hands. His body slowly became relaxed, and he made no effort to fight back. I looked down to see the knife penetrating Jordan's gut. I looked back at his face. It was Jordan looking at me, not the monster that had possessed him before. He smiled at me, not a sadistic grin, but a calm smile of relief. His eyes slowly closed, and he laid on his head on my chest, becoming completely motionless. The blood was still rushing over my hands. I didn't know what was going on anymore, but I couldn't stand the pressure. I pushed the body off of me, leaving the knife where it had entered his abdomen. I walked out of the house in a state of pure shock. It was as if I had happily suddenly vanished from my mind, and only my inattentive was being to be walking home. I got home and took off my blood-soaked clothes. Then it happened in the shower. I watched Jordan's blood wash off my body and flow down into the drain. After I got out of the shower, I put on a clear pair of clothes and threw my bloody ones into the trash. I walked out of the bathroom and down the hallway towards Jordan's room, turning the massage machine on by habit as I passed it. I froze in the doorway of my room where Jordan's voice began to play on the machine. "Hey, I know you just left, but I'm glad you came over to visit. I'll be at your place tomorrow, maybe around 5 in the afternoon. The machine beeped. The automated voice announced that the message was sent around 8 p.m. last night. I must have been on my way back home from Jordan's house when he called. I glanced over at the clock. It was 4:58 p.m., 2 minutes away from when he said he'd be by. I sat back on my bed, blocking the violent memories of what happened, retaining the only thought that Jordan wouldn't be coming back. I wanted to cry, but I didn't have the energy to. I stared at the clock on the wall, watching the second hand tick closer to the next minute. I began to immerse myself in thoughts of hanging out with Jordan, where we were at the park, laughing at something, maybe a stupid joke of one of us told. At the minute hand reached closer to the hour, the dream world where Jordan was still alive fading away drifted back to this sad and lonely reality. Here I am now, at the end of my story. I lay here alone in my house, my best friend wiped from my life. What now? Who will I hang out with over the weekends? I have no one I can trust to tell my secrets to anymore. No one to care enough to listen to what I have to say. I close my eyes, roll over, hoping that when I awake, this will have just been a nightmare. There is a sudden and loud, powerful slam from the front door. The sound resonates down the hallway and through the walls of the house. Followed by a slow, scratching sound along the wall, getting closer and closer to my bedroom door.